Is it water with the sheep in the box?
What is a Luddite? Well, in common parlance, it basically means someone who is opposed to change and progress, and is usually an insult targeted towards people who are believed to oppose the natural and inevitable progression of technology. For example, a person opposed to, say, AI, electric cars, the replacement of fiat currency with cryptocurrency, etc., could be called a Luddite, usually derisively, by proponents of these ideas or technologies. I, for example, have been called a Luddite for voicing concerns about self-driving cars and their seeming tendency to just drive directly into groups of pedestrians by one of my friends, and by some guy in a chip shop when I said that cryptocurrency is never going to be more powerful or widely used than the pound or dollar. You may or may not be aware that the term Luddite is actually a reference to a very real socio-economic political movement prevalent in the 19th century, with its roots much earlier in history, who, in my opinion, were arguably justified in their aims and actions, or at the very least understandable. So, I hear you asking, who were the original Luddites? Is it, in fact, kind of based to be called a Luddite? Well, in short, the brief, reductive Wikipedia-level definition is that the Luddites were an organisation of English textile workers in the 19th century who formed a radical faction which destroyed textile machinery, like a kind of vigilante anti-loom militia, I guess. The group is believed by some historians to have taken its name from Ned Ludd, a legendary weaver from Anstey near Leicester who, supposedly, in 1779, after either being whipped for idleness or taunted by local youths for the same, depending on the version of the story, smashed two knitting frames, a kind of early weaving machine, in what was described as a fit of passion. Throughout the 19th century, the Luddites protested against manufacturers who used machines in what they called a fraudulent and deceitful manner to get around standard labour practices, as they believed that the time spent learning the skills of their craft would go to waste, as machines would replace their role in the industry, making them obsolete and economically destituting traditional weavers. Many Luddites were owners of, or former employees in, independent workshops that had been forced to close because factories could sell similar products for less money due to the automated machines they could afford. But when these former weavers set out to find a job at one of these factories, offering their years of experience and skill to them, it was actually very hard to find one because, obviously, producing things in factories required fewer workers than producing those same things in a workshop, which was the whole point, and left many people unemployed and angry, and even those that were employed were underpaid, as their skill and expertise was less valuable when most of the work was done by machines. People who'd spent years or even decades learning a trade and serving their communities were all of a sudden unable to feed themselves or provide for their families, and the factories that replaced them couldn't employ all of them because less workers were required than weaving workshops had existed prior to the proliferation of the new machinery. The Luddite movement is believed to have begun in Nottingham and culminated in a region-wide rebellion that lasted from 1811 to 1816, causing massive unrest and property damage. To an extent, the Luddites were actually relatively successful in achieving their aims. In the end, mill and factory owners took to paying people to begin shooting protesters, and eventually the movement was violently suppressed with legal and military force, which included execution and penal transportation of accused and convicted Luddites. So, let's be completely clear here. The Luddites were not just some backwards Amish-esque weirdos who hated technology, as the modern usage of the term may imply, but in fact disgruntled, desperate working-class people who were displaced and made unemployed and destitute by the Industrial Revolution and automation of many industries making their trade obsolete. They were, in my opinion, justifiably angry and lashed out at the source of their struggles, the textile bosses, and were violently quelled and murdered by the rising capitalist machine, much like their trade had been crushed by the very real weaving machines. The Luddite quellings put me in mind of the tragedies throughout the labour movement of the 20th century, notably the Ludlow massacre, in which the army and capitalist-funded thugs set a camp of striking workers on fire and shot into the camp, killing up to 25 people, including burning 12 children to death in 1914. The Luddites were participating in similar anti-capitalist direct action and were treated very similarly, in my opinion. Remember, this was all happening pre-welfare state. If you were out of work in the 19th century, you were pretty much fucked. There were no unemployment benefits, no food banks, no homeless shelters, none of that outside of the fucking workhouse, which, being honest, were just objectively terrible, brutal, cruel places. Being put out of work at this time was, if not a death sentence, then close enough to one that it justified severe and violent retaliation out of sheer desperation. This was a time when child labour and slavery was legal, but the concept of retirement or sick pay was not. That stuff didn't come around for another 100 years. Hi, it's Editing Matt here. I thought I should probably add some context to the working conditions of the Industrial Revolution in England, as apparently it's not as common knowledge as I thought, having spoken about the concepts discussed in this video to some people IRL, especially to people outside the UK. So just to be clear here, during the Industrial Revolution in the UK, the working conditions were utterly fucking horrific. Normal shifts for a factory worker were usually 12 to 16 hours a day, often with extra time required during busy periods. Workers were often required to clean their machines during their meal times. A typical wage for a male worker was about 15 shillings or 75 pence a week, but women and children were paid much less, with women earning 7 shillings, 35 pence, and children 3 shillings or 15 pence. For this reason, employers often preferred to employ women and children. Many men were sacked when they reached adulthood, then they had to be supported by their wives and children. Child labour was extremely common, and in factories, forcing children to crawl into dangerous unguarded machinery to clear blockages, for example, was infamous for causing many gruesome accidents. Up to 40% of accident cases at Manchester Infirmary in 1833 were factory accidents, for example. And then there were the issues of personal health. Cotton thread had to be spun in damp, warm conditions. Going straight out into the cold night air led to many cases of pneumonia. The air was full of dust, and obviously the factories were unventilated, which led to chest and lung disease, and loud noise made by machines damaged workers' hearing. But that's just strictly within the factories. Many of these workers couldn't afford to live in decent housing. Many lived in unsanitary places infested with rats and disease, and overcrowding led to the prevalence of workhouses and poorhouses, where if you were really desperate, you could pay a couple of pennies to sleep hanging over a rope pulled taut across a room, the so-called 2-penny hangover, which of course is where the term hangover originates. I feel like I bring this up a lot, but it's important to remember that the discovery of germ theory was first published in 1861, and it was only accepted by the scientific establishment that mixing human shit with drinking water caused bad health outcomes in 1854. Child labour wasn't outlawed until 1833, and even then it was limited to those below the age of 13. It took another 100 years to raise this age to 15 with the Children and Young Persons Act of 1933. Pensions weren't introduced until 1908 with the Old Age Pensions Act. Those deliberately kept too low to live a decent life, and the basic state pension we now recognise was introduced in 1948. The triple lock, which we now consider an important safety net for pensions, and in my opinion should be applied to wages as well, but that's a different story, wasn't introduced until 2010. The 10-hour workday wasn't introduced until 1847, and officially there has been no formal introduction of the 8-hour workday in the UK, though it is generally accepted as the norm these days. Basic worker safety wasn't regulated until 1833, and even then only barely, finally being completely legislated in 1974. Contrast that with the comparatively pleasant experience of working in a cottage industry, which of course was still pretty bleak because, well, we hadn't invented basic shit like indoor plumbing or central heating, and by its nature the cottage industry worker would need to work long hours depending on sunlight to provide for the community they served, or even as a medieval serf. Now, obviously, by no means was the life of a serf a decent one by today's standards, but it could be argued that it was significantly better than that of the worker in England during the Industrial Revolution, in most respects, though obviously this is just my opinion. There's that fun fact that serfs often had more free time than the average worker today that keeps being brought up, just as an example. This is of course much of the point of Marxism. The relationship between worker and capitalist is really not all that different than that between lord and serf, and some terms from the previous system stuck around. A landlord is a normal part of our modern life, so much that we never really think about where the word came from, but it originates from feudalism, where the lord of the land, or landlord, would exploit the people living on his land, which is really very analogous to the modern relationship between landlord and tenant. But at least serfs didn't have to live and work in such terrible conditions conditions of unregulated early capitalism. So, with all this in mind, I think it's pretty clear that if you're used to working from your countryside cottage, serving your small, close-knit community, having that livelihood stripped from you, and being told that basically you have to give up your life and sell yourself into the employ of the giant capitalist machine, live in squalor, work most of the day and be unable to afford basic shelter, never mind support your family to the point where your small children may be forced into dangerous work at basically any age, well, it's difficult not to view that as an overt threat of violence, in my opinion, and thus, again, in my opinion, arguably justifies an equally violent response. As I'll go on to discuss in a moment, simply pointing out that life nowadays is better both in the Victorian workhouse and the cottage industry and or serfdom doesn't mean that people formerly self-employed and generally better off being forced into being crushed under the capitalist boot because the inexorable march of progress has victims had no right to resist. You have to break a few eggs to make an omelette is a phrase I've been faced with when having this conversation IRL, and whilst it is undeniably true, that doesn't mean that the eggs have to like it, or that they're in the wrong if they try to resist or fight back. It just seems a little callous to dismiss real people as eggs or some other inanimate object whose suffering is simply necessary in order to get to the modern world, with no consideration for their humanity. And don't get me wrong, I like the modern world, I think industrialization is good and important. I'm not an anarcho-primitivist or some shit, but I also believe that industrialization under an unfeeling system focused entirely on profit at the expense of workers will inevitably lead to the suffering of the workers who begin to be seen as unfortunately necessary, though expendable, cogs in the capitalist machine. The last industrial revolution should give us some lessons to learn from if and when the next one comes around, which people online have been predicting is a few years away for a long time now. Hopefully we'll actually learn and try to mitigate some of the issues that led to the Luddites feeling so hard done to when the robots finally do take over, though I'm not holding my breath. Alright, context provided, back to past Matt. In the 19th century, jobs that arose from the growth of trade, like factory and dock workers, were notorious for precarious employment. Underemployment was chronic and widespread during this period, and it was common practice to retain a larger workforce than was typically necessary for insurance against labour shortages in boom times, and just only pay them if required, but in such a way as to not enable them to get other work to supplement their income. Much like nowadays, in order to avoid paying out benefits afforded to full-time workers, many employers have started relying almost entirely upon zero-hour contracts, or in some cases requiring workers to register as self-employed to maximise profits while keeping workers desperate and reliant on their employers. The so-called gig economy, as it's known. Uber is the main one people will be aware of, but food couriers are another example. In both cases, this is insecure, precarious, and often extremely low-paid work. If people in these jobs were to oppose bringing in technology to replace their already precarious employment, like for example delivery drones or self-driving taxis. This actually happened when traditional taxi drivers protested Uber, of course, because they didn't want to be forced to accept worse conditions and lower pay for the same job. I don't think we would consider them unreasonable in doing so, and certainly we wouldn't dismiss them as inherently opposed to technology and progress in general, to the point where 200 years later the name of their movement is synonymous with ignorant, backwards idiots refusing to accept the inevitable march of technological progression. Or so I hope, I guess. It's not an exact analogy, but look at the ways corporations nowadays have moved a lot of their factories overseas to places they can more readily mistreat and abuse workers. Corporate exploitation is rampant in the third world right now, and why? For money and productivity and efficiency. Do not be mistaken, capitalists will stop at nothing to maximize these things at the explicit expense of the workers, because to a corporation, a worker is not a person. They are a resource and must be squeezed and stretched to breaking point to drain all value from them. Can't have people slacking off, by which I mean having breaks and basic workers' rights, now can we? A corporation will always prefer a machine to a person because machines cannot unionize, cannot ask for time off, and cannot sue. Likewise, in much the same way, workers in the third world are often prevented from doing these things due to a mixture of corrupt governments and a lax attitude towards use of paramilitary groups to suppress strikes. Corporations already view people as robots, and where they can get away with it, they treat them like robots too. If your employer replaces replaces you with a robot and you want to protest or fight back as a result, good. And likewise, if a corporation moves its operations to the third world in order to more easily get away with exploitation, they should absolutely be publicly shamed and protested against for that. Sentiment held by the Luddites is not isolated in time. For another recent analogy, look at the recent stuff around closure of coal mines. The thing is, the people who got relentlessly mocked for saying stuff like just learn to code when coal miners complained about losing their jobs due to the obvious fact that relearning an entirely new skill set, especially later in life, in order to go into a completely alien sector of the job market, which is looking for highly specialized jobs and does not have enough available positions for all former miners to take, even if we ignore the cost, time investment, and short to medium term economic hardship of having to reskill while unemployed, is simple let them eat cake style detachment from reality and what it means to be working class in the modern world. And I would argue isn't all that different to people derisively calling people Luddites nowadays. Sure, it is good that we as a society are transitioning away from fossil fuels and towards more renewables, but when we have a mass societal change like this, unless we put in a safety net, there are inevitably going to be people who get really hurt during the transition from one state of affairs to the other, as was the case in transition from feudalism to capitalism and during the Industrial Revolution, transitioning from more cottage industries to factory production lines. Just look at the recent conversations we're having about automation in the modern world for an illustration of this, or watch that one CGP Grey video from back before he started submitting false copyright strikes against critics for a quick overview. More and more people are being put out of work by automation, be that the self-checkout machines in supermarkets, algorithms that are able to outcompete humans in many admin and tech positions, or self-driving cars, which at the moment aren't great, but eventually will likely become good enough to be better drivers than humans, and once that happens, that's multiple industries staffed almost entirely by robots. Warehouse jobs in some places are being replaced by automated robots, as are a lot of manufacturing jobs. This is how capitalism functions, basically. It's cheaper and more efficient to do something that harms working class people, so that's how it gets done, and the people it happens to can go fucking die for all capitalists care. If that also helps make the world a better place, that is purely coincidental. But the problem is that a lot of people are going to be made unemployed for this reason in a relatively short amount of time because it is economically advantageous for employers to do so. And unlike previous industrial revolutions or overhauls of how production has worked, this automation revolution seems unlikely to create as many jobs as it destroys. As I said, go watch that one CGP Grey video if you want a more thorough breakdown. It's one of his good ones, mostly because it doesn't touch too much on history or politics. Here's the thing, in theory all these jobs going away could improve society in the long run. It could help us achieve a truly post-scarcity economy. The robots could, in the long term, pave the way to a fully automated luxury gay space communist utopia by doing all the labour for us, allowing us to finally escape the shackles of the capitalist mode of production and our broken exploitative system of work and wages. In the long term then, automation and new technology can be, and usually is, better for us as a society. However, that utopian future only happens if we somehow manage to transition to a system in which people are able to get by without working by implementing something like universal basic income, or indeed by commodifying necessities like food, housing, etc., and that is a big if. Likewise, this is a far-off utopian ideal that, yes, could happen within the next 100 years, or even sooner if we're lucky, but between everyone losing their jobs and humanity reaching a Star Trek-esque system of egalitarian post-scarcity, there is a lot of potential struggle and hardship that can and probably will take place, and it will be callous and naive to sit here and say, well, okay, sure, society is falling apart, everyone's starving to death, and you can't feed your kids because there are no jobs and the government is refusing to step in where capitalists won't. But just think about it. In 50 years, we'll be living in a much better society, so stop complaining. Hell, this is even the case in Star Trek. Before they even started creating what would eventually become the Earth we see in TNG and to a lesser extent TOS, the citizens of Earth had to go through the Bell Riots, and the journey to the Federation was not an easy one.
By the early 2020s, there was a place like this in every major city in the United States.
Why are these people in here? Are they criminals?
No, people with criminal records weren't allowed in the sanctuary districts.
Then what do they do to deserve this?
Nothing. Just people. Without jobs or places to live.
So they get put in here?
Welcome to the 21st century, Doctor.
Our journey to post-scarcity will be similar, I suspect.
The working man was sacrificed! Turned us into
A promise of future improvements to society does not invalidate the struggles or complaints of people in the here and now. Yes, it is better to have renewable energy than fossil fuels, but that doesn't mean that coal miners being out of work and struggling to find new employment is not a problem, and self-driving cars are probably going to be a positive thing in the long term, but the fact that just about everyone who makes their money from driving will be made unemployed still sucks in the short term. And, of course, just because we can make clothing much easier and more efficiently with textiles factories and the machines contained therein, does not mean that the formerly professional weavers, people who are angry because they as a result are made unemployed and to an extent unemployable, much like drivers may soon be and many miners are currently, are in some way unreasonable backwards idiots opposed to progress or change. This has been a defence of the Luddites, and in my opinion, unfairly and unjustly maligned political group who, though I don't necessarily entirely agree with them, I do not think that the legacy and modern view of their movement is fair or accurate. If anything, it could be argued that the Luddites were proto-socialists, and that their militant tactics and eventual violent quelling is quite reminiscent of the IWW and other similar socialist groups in the 20th century, who won working class people many of the rights we enjoy today in the face of incredibly violent suppression, but 100 years before what we would now describe as the labour movement. In my opinion, that makes them worthy of respect and recognition. It is not anti-progress or unreasonable to oppose a system putting people out of work and rendering them unable to survive and providing for themselves and their loved ones when we live under an economic setup that requires us to work in order to afford to live. It is also possible to do so while simultaneously believing that technology is overall good for the world, though not always. The nuclear bomb is a prime example of bad technology, but I don't think anti-nuclear war people can reasonably be called Luddites. Technology is a tool that can be used for either good or evil. Let's hope that we'll learn to use it for the betterment of society, or if not, let's hope we don't totally fuck up the world before our children stop us. Let's correct the record and acknowledge that the Luddites were kind of based actually, and their example is a kind of inspirational and relevant one.